Okay, so we have variables. Now we can represent a lot of different types of information. And we also have expressions, so we can perform calculations and assign those calculations to a variable and write those calculations out. So what we're going to do next is we're going to discuss methods. Now, you've actually used a couple of methods so far. Write line as a method, read key as a method. Main is the, ironically, main method. So when you double click on an exe, like when you double clicked on the Visual Studio.exe, the file, to run Visual Studio the first time and install it, the operating system takes that program, which is just a long listing of statements like we have here, like we've been doing, and it says start at the first place. Where do you begin execution? So you've seen execution start from top to bottom, but the operating system has to know, because you've got all of these programs in memory and all of these things happening, where does this specific program start? And in C#, it starts in main. So you saw that we had named variables. Well, now if you understand that you can name variables, you can also name other things within your program and use them by name. And main is a name, write line is a name, read key. The thing that you'll notice that distinguishes methods from variables, and when you use them by name, is that you'll see that they have a pair of parentheses after the name. So let's understand, before we go into detail into methods and how we use methods, let's understand a little bit of the structure of our program here, get a little more detail of that. A namespace is a container for classes. It's a way of organizing. So I would say that it's kind of like one of those stacking dolls. You've got a larger doll that contains a smaller doll that contains a smaller doll, if you've ever seen those. The namespace contains classes or types. Now, classes are blueprints for things. So a namespace, inside of its braces is a block. Inside of that is classes. So I could define another class down here within these braces of the namespace. And then within that class, I would have a method or variables. So classes can contain variables. So int value equals 5. And then inside of that are methods. So the class contains methods. And this method is named main. So it's just look at it as varying containers. Now, to get inside of these containers, you use periods or dot operators. So how does this work? So think about this for a minute. We have console.writeLine. Console, if you look at it, if you hover over it, is a class in system.console. Where else do you see system on this page? Up here, system. And if you hover over it, you see that it's a namespace. So we've been using the writeLine method in the console class, which lives inside of the namespace system. Now you can understand what this term using system means. It's taking this file and saying, bring in the namespace. So we can use other code from elsewhere. Bring in the namespace system. And when you bring in the namespace system, you also bring in its classes, which also brings in its methods. Now, methods are named blocks of code that actually do something. So we've put all of our statements inside of main that lives inside a program that lives inside of HackerRank Test, where writeLine has its own set of statements that does things like writes values out to the console, and that lives inside of console, which lives inside of system. So when we said using system, we're saying bring in the system namespace and give us access to all of these other methods that other people have written. Now, so we're getting into some very fun stuff here. Some very interesting stuff. Because we can create our own named methods. Now for now, I just want you to take another leap of faith like you did when we were writing out creating variables. And you were writing your first lines of code. Is we're going to create another method. So let's do something first. An average. When you're getting the average of something, you're adding up all of the values and dividing them by the count. So let's create an integer number equals 5. Integer number 2 equals 6. Integer number 3 equals 7. Our count is 3 numbers. And our integer average equals number plus num2 plus num3 divided by 3. So I've used parentheses here to specify precedence. That says anything within PEMDAS. I don't know if you remember that from school, but I'm using parentheses to say add up all of these numbers before we divide by 3 and then assign that number into the variable average. That's how you would say that. So I'm saying first things first when we're looking at this statement, add num1, num2, num3, take that value, divide it by 3, and then assign that to average. So that's one thing that's different when we're looking at computer languages is we're so used to reading from left to right. But there are some things happening in a statement that aren't exactly just left to right. We're kind of hopping around a little bit, and you need to be able to read those statements. But nevertheless, to stay on focus, to stay on point, now I want to write out average. So all of the things that we're doing here are things that you've learned so far. There's no new skills that we've introduced, but I want to show you that we've created a sequence of statements, and we're taking that value and writing it out. So 5 plus 6 plus 7 divided by 3 should be 6, which is the average. Now there's 2 points I want to bring out here. We would, every time that we wanted to average something, we would not necessarily want to create all of this. So we want to reuse this logic multiple times. Now in code, one of the things that we have to do, one of the key problem-solving things, one of the key core elements of programming is taking a calculation or a way of doing something that's outside of programming. Programming with languages are just languages. I mean, you're just using words. There's nothing special or fancy in it. But it's your understanding of a problem and your understanding of calculating things or working with data. And we're imposing that on our code, our language. So we're taking the idea of averaging, we're taking the idea of making averages, which exists outside of C# and completely outside of programming, and we're bringing that into a series of statements that replicate or represent the act of averaging. Okay, so that's just a very key tangent of the core of programming is you're taking knowledge that's actually outside of programming and C# altogether, and we're recreating that calculation or that way of doing things inside of programming. So what do we want to do here? We want to create a method that we can call just like WriteLine and get the average. So let's follow the signature, the method signature that we have already. So we have static void main. So we're going to do static. I'll tell you what those mean later. Average, that's the name of it, just like we had named a variable. We add our parentheses. We create our own block, because these blocks, these two braces, create a block. It's saying these things go together. And we're going to take all of this logic that we just had here. I'm going to cut it out, put it here. Now, by looking at the other code, what do you think we need to do? Well, we need to call average. Now, we brought in system and then did console.readKey. Well, we are inside a program already. So all we have to do is type the name of our method, and we should just get 6. 6. So we've taken all of this logic that we had here in main, we grouped it together, we pulled it out, and we put it into a named block of code called average. And now, if we want to call average again and again and again, average, kind of nonsensical, but if you take all of those together, we should get 4 6s. And we do. So you see, this block of code is, so instead of writing this section of code multiple times, we write it one time, and we do what's called calling the method multiple times to reuse that block of code over and over and over again. So that's the essence of methods. So now when you look at this, you have a little better understanding of what we're looking at. A namespace is just a container that contains classes, that contains methods, and these methods within themselves contain a series of statements that we can name and reuse. And main itself is the very first method that's called by the operating system, or that's called by the CLR, Common Language Runtime, is the very first method that's called. And then inside of that, main calls average, again, 4 times. So that's a big step. There's a lot to digest in that, but that's a very, very crucial stepping stone for you as a developer and learning to be a software developer.